The grand conclusion of this video series is that the authors of the Hebrew Bible respected the myths of the Vedics and the Egyptians in one way or another, and you should too. They even treated them with reverence. They even based stories of their God on them. Why not allow this instead to give you reverence for the ancient tradition you are a part of? At a certain point of contemplating the story of Abraham and his sons in Genesis, I realized I was breathing the air of the Shatapatha Brahmana. It's true that there is a Phoenician myth involving the god El sacrificing his son Yedud and even instituting circumcision, as Abraham also institutes circumcision. These details being so close to what Abraham does, it seemed that Abraham was simply a variation of this myth. And as El is the Rudra type, so Abraham was Rudra. But I couldn't escape the sense that I was breathing different air than this Phoenician myth when reading Abraham's story, and that I had breathed this air before. Unlike the El in the Phoenician myth from Sanchuniathon's account, Abraham doesn't actually sacrifice his son. This could easily be explained by a simple change in the story due to historical circumstances, but it is an undeniable difference. Furthermore, Abraham doesn't actually want to sacrifice his son, and doesn't come up with the idea to do so either. God commands he do so in a very specific kind of test that constitutes the whole narrative arc of his story. Abraham is then stopped in a very specific and dramatic sacrifice interruption. God is the one with the will for the sacrifice test of Abraham, and then the one who decides when to stop it, via the voice of his angel. On the other hand, El is a god himself, the high god, unlike Abraham, and no outside god tells El to sacrifice his son. His is the will behind the whole act, which is not interrupted. He fully sacrifices his son. Thus, the entire feeling and motive of the two stories are very different. And a coherent story usually arises from a distinct motive, and because of this, carries a distinct feeling. Abraham, with such different motives and actions, appears an entirely different character from El. Again, this can of course be explained away by theorizing a change to Abraham's story, due to plausible motives. But after some time, I couldn't escape the feeling, when reading Abraham's story, that I was practically reading the Shatapatha Brahmana, and that the El connection was not getting to the actual basis of the Abraham of Genesis. The first thing that caught in my mind was the fact that the Shatapatha Brahmana is primarily about Purusha and Prajapati, or Purusha Prajapati, two forms of one creator god figure, essentially. And this Purusha Prajapati is urgently trying to reproduce from himself throughout the Brahmana. Over and over again, he expresses his desire to reproduce. And then the text states that he toils and practices austerities until he finally reproduces himself in one way or another. At one point, it says that he practices austerities for 1,000 years to avert death. And in other passages, as we will see, he simply practices austerities for an indeterminate time to be able to reproduce. This aversion of death and wanting to reproduce are also intertwined, as death sometimes intervenes to stop his process of reproduction. As Jan Gonda says in his book, Prajapati's Rise to Higher Rank, quote, "His procreative ability is, indeed, again and again interrupted when he becomes disjointed or relaxed and needs restoration. See, e.g., Shatapatha Brahmana 6.1.2.12. And it is the very restoration of the creator god which is the raison d'etre of the Agni Kayana, or fire altar ritual. Shatapatha Brahmana 6.1.1.1, unquote." And this is from Jan Gonda, page 84. This Purusha Prajapati is represented, quote, "as desiring and being able to obtain procreative power, which is his specialty, by means of a special method of performing one of the most elaborate ceremonies of the Vedic ritual," unquote. Gonda, page 84. This reminded me of Abraham, in essence, who is unable to have a child with his wife until old age, despite praying for one. The text making him around 100 by the time of his second son Isaac's birth, rather than having the 1,000 years that are symbolic of Purusha Prajapati and his stated lifespan. Abraham's prayers replace the austerities and complex rituals of Purusha Prajapati. Genesis 15, 2-3 reads, quote, "But Abraham said, 'Sovereign Lord, what can you give me since I remain childless, and the one who will inherit my estate is Eliezer of Damascus?' And Abraham said, 'You have given me no children.'" Unquote. Yet after many years of waiting and praying, Abraham, apparently in his 80s, has a child, Ishmael, with his wife's handmaid, Hagar, and then also with his wife Sarah at about age 100. Crucially, Abraham wants to have children, very badly. Indeed, he is filled with the desire to have children, so much so that it defines his character for much of his story. As aforementioned, it is not he who wants to sacrifice his son, his beloved son. It is God who is the driving will in the sacrifice test. On the other side, the Rudra type, which El belongs with, generally does not want children per se. And I'm not referring to El himself, but the Rudra type, specifically the Vedic Rudra, where this theology is the clearest. While Prajapati is the god of procreation, though there is some paradox and nuance to the issue, Rudra at his esoteric core is not, although he does reproduce. Their purposes generally point in opposite directions, and this is part of why they are antagonists of one another. Prajapati embodying the generative acts, and Rudra attacking the generative act. Rudra even is known to point his arrow of destruction at nascent life, to consume embryos, like Kronos, his Greek parallel, also consumes his son, and to refuse to procreate sons, as Shiva does, when asked to by Prajapati. He is a rather cold god in this regard, inward-looking, and ever leading back to unity with the Absolute, and thus away from generative outflow, that is, procreation. And again, this is in general and not all the time. Cronus murderously swallows the son he regrets ever having fathered. He is not the loving father forced to sacrifice his son out of reverence in that myth. The sons Odin has are often fathered only to achieve an urgent need, such as vengeance. As for Rudra, the same is done for the purpose of demon slaying. This doesn't mean the Rudra type can never show paternal affection either, but this opposition or indifference to having children is the general nature of his type. This really has to be noted and confronted when looking at Abraham for what he is. Abraham's urgency and absorption in the desire specifically to have sons is not well fitted to the Rudra type. It is almost the opposite, although again, there is much gray area. Meanwhile, it is perfectly fitted to the Purusha Prajapati of the Shatapatha Brahmana, who proclaims out loud his desire for offspring and then urgently performs lengthy austerities to finally be able to reproduce himself specifically, not just to engage in the sexual procreative act either. Furthermore, the whole atmosphere of the sacrifice test of Abraham's main story motifs somehow just reminded me of the Shatapatha Brahmana. Purusha Prajapati, especially in this text, is the archetypal sacrificer. This is a text going through scene after scene of dramatized sacrificial rites, hundreds of pages of them, with this Purusha or Prajapati as the sacrificer. Sacrificial rites are seen from numerous angles here. The scenarios and motifs are many, and looked at after reading these, Abraham's binding of Isaac suddenly feels like just one more in the long line of sacrificial scenarios common to that Brahmana. So with this feeling that Abraham was somehow connected typologically or genetically to the Shatapatha Brahmana becoming unshakable, I was driven back to that text. When I began looking anew at the Brahmana with this key, I quickly found my intuition affirmed, and more than I could even have anticipated. Right there in the 13th Khanda of the Shatapatha Brahmana is a human sacrifice by a sacrificer who is embodying the myth of Purusha Narayana, And this human sacrifice, at the moment the human victims are bound to be sacrificed, is interrupted by an invisible divine voice, telling the sacrificer not to sacrifice the humans. He releases the human victims then and sacrifices animals instead, cows in this case. Quote, by means of the Purusha Narayana litany, the Brahman priest seated to the right, south of them, praises the men bound to the stakes with this 16-versed hymn, Rigveda 10.90 and Vag S 31, 1 through 16. Now the victims had had the fire carried round them, but they were not yet slaughtered. Then a voice said to him, the sacrificer, Purusha, do not consummate these human victims. If thou wert to consummate them, man, that is Purusha, would eat man. Accordingly, as soon as fire had been carried around them, he set them free and offered oblations to the same divinities, and thereby gratified those divinities, and thus they gratified him with all objects of desire. The Udayaniya concluding oblation having been completed, he seizes 11 barren cows, sacred to Mitra Varuna, the Visvedeva and Brihaspati, with the view of winning these deities, unquote. And this is found in Shatapatha Brahmana 13.6.2.12 through 13 and 16. Note how even the fire being carried around the bound victims, human victims, is mentioned. As in the Abraham passage, Isaac remarks aloud how, quote, the fire and wood are here, unquote, just before he is bound. This Brahmana passage was incredible to find and can't be downplayed. No other parallel event in other traditions that is usually compared with the binding of Isaac involves a literal divine voice directly addressing the sacrificer to interrupt a human sacrifice and release the bound victim or victims right before sacrifice. Combined with the theme of Purusha Prajapati desiring offspring and toiling and practicing austerities for years to attain this goal, a picture very consistent with Abraham was beginning to appear. This isn't the whole Isaac story, though, for Isaac is bound specifically during a test of faith in God. The Purusha Narayana interrupted sacrifice just described doesn't have anything of this sort of framing. It is not a test of faith or reverence. But the Shatapatha Brahmana is a book of many sacrificial scenarios. And simply turning to another section of the text, the other key motif of the Isaac story revealed itself as well. In the very first book of the Brahmana, the mortal sacrificer Manu is recalled, specifically the time when Manu was tested for his reverence for God and commanded to sacrifice a beloved family member to prove this reverence. This test is given to Manu by 2 demon priests, but nonetheless, the key motif holds the same. The demons say, quote, God-fearing, they say, is Manu. Let us then ascertain. They went to him and said, Manu, we will sacrifice for thee. He said, wherewith? They said, with this, thy wife. He said, so be it. And on her being killed, that voice went from her, unquote. From Shatapatha Brahmana 1.1.4, 15 through 16. Egeling, the translator, uses the word God-fearing here, as the original word has that sense to it. But the word is Shraddha Devi, more literally denoting a transcending kind of God reverence. Whether God fear or God reverence, this is extremely close to what Abraham's test is said to be about in the text of Genesis. The motif is about whether Manu is God-fearing / God-revering, just as the outcome of Abraham's test shows that it was about the same thing. Genesis 22:12 reads, quote, I now know that you revere / fear God and didn't hold back your son, your only son, from me, unquote. Again, the word here literally means to fear, but also is sometimes translated as to revere. Secondly, the test asks Manu to sacrifice a beloved family member. In the case of Manu, it is his wife rather than his son. Lastly, is the unflinching quickness with which Manu complies with the test. Manu says almost no words, other than confirming that he will do the sacrifice, and asks no questions, but immediately sacrifices his wife when asked to do so. This very unflinchingness is famous in Abraham's behavior during the binding and colors the whole episode, as he says nothing and asks nothing, but immediately complies with God's demand and sets out to sacrifice his son. Obviously, Manu follows through with this sacrifice of his wife, while Abraham's sacrifice is interrupted. But we have already seen where the interrupted sacrifice motif involving the divine voice came from. Thus, it is a simple step to say that when you put together the test of God reverence from the Manu myth and the interrupted sacrifice motif from the Narayana Purusha myth, you have essentially recreated the binding of Isaac's story in its main two elements. It's all right there in two stories of the Shatapatha Brahmana. Only two small but precise motifs found within the same book, and you get the binding of Isaac. Now that's good economy. This can be seen clearly in part because we got away from the false lead of the L parallel, which cannot explain all of these details and dramatic moments in the way that Abraham's story actually appears to us. Now, I will say that my argument does not demand that the L parallel could not have had any influence on Abraham's story. It may even be likely that some details or narrative choices were taken from the L myth or a related tradition that the authors knew. But what this evidence shows is that the L myth was not the main foundational narrative used to make Abraham's story. The actual story we have in Genesis with the actual story of the binding. It shows that, if anything, stories like that of El and other Near Eastern motifs of child sacrifice that are known, with only a loose resemblance to what Abraham actually does, can only have the status of echoes or intertextual references within Abraham's story frame. Perhaps these are being referenced and perhaps not. Perhaps they influence the composition and compositional choices, and perhaps not. The fundamental structure of the entire Isaac binding story, as it is, can be accounted for much more fully from the combination of the two motifs from the Shatapatha Brahmana instead, without as much alteration, and therefore the L parallel becomes secondary, and even must be marked as a bit misleading with regard to how the story seems to have actually been composed. Echoes within the story of Isaac being called the beloved son, for instance, echoing Yedud, son of El, these indeed might go back to the El story or other related narratives, and this layer shouldn't be discounted. It just doesn't form the bedrock layer of the story or shape the theological motifs that are woven into it on that level. The entire theme of faith in God, self-abnegation, deliverance by the testing God, and the cancellation of human sacrifice. Even the circumcision custom appears to only be in the priestly layer of the biblical text, and so could have been added on toward the end, if the priestly author saw a general similarity between the already written Abraham and El that he wanted to sew the custom onto. Native customs being sewn onto the Brahmana narrative foundation is part of what my theory is suggesting. Furthermore, a far greater number of scenes and themes in Abraham's story can be directly accounted for solely from the Shatapatha Brahmana compared to other postulated sources such as the El myth, which further supports that this was the text the authors were directly adapting. And if this is the case, then any echoes of El or any other myth must be secondary or coincidental. There can be a compositing situation going on here, with the Shatapatha Brahmana narrative motifs as the base layer and other motifs composited onto this. But each of these other sources needs to be more carefully considered regarding whether it is a necessary piece of the picture, with the Brahmana source taken into consideration, as explaining much that these other sources were trying to explain in a patchwork way and less completely. There is another story found in the Aitareya Brahmana, which is mentioned in other texts as well, like the Mahabharata, which some scholars have connected to the interrupted sacrifice scene of the Shatapatha Brahmana. And it also involves a father who is unable to have a son, and who, having anxiety over his inheritance, prays to God, here Varuna, for a son. This is the story of Harishchandra. Eventually, Varuna demands Harishchandra's son be sacrificed to him to fulfill the bargain. The son manages to substitute another boy for himself, this being Sunashepa, by offering his father 100 cows. The priests, which include Vasistha and Vishvamitra, refuse to slaughter the boy, however, and so his father offers to sacrifice his own son in exchange for another 100 cows. At the moment of sacrifice, the boy prays to Ushas and the other gods, and his bonds are released. Vishvamitra then adopts him. In the theme of a father not being able to conceive a son, praying for a son, and then being asked by the god to sacrifice the son, but the sacrifice finally being interrupted at the moment of sacrifice, it is quite similar to Abraham's story. This story has many details and narrative framings that are not present in the Abraham story, however, and when compared with the Shatapatha Brahmana motifs, the latter seem more exact to what we see in the Binding of Isaac episode itself. Harishchandra does not comply with the demand to sacrifice his loved one without complaint or delay, as Manu and Abraham do. Instead, Harishchandra avoids and delays as long as he can, with his son finally substituting another, and Sunashepa's father then requires his son be bought from him for the sacrifice, with his performance of the sacrifice also having to be bought, while even the priests refuse to do the sacrificial act. This doesn't follow the Abraham and Manu scenes thematically or in detail then, which are all about prompt compliance to prove fear of God specifically. Also, Sunashepa's sacrifice is not interrupted by a divine voice telling the sacrificer to stop just before he kills the boy, but instead is the result of the boy praying and the bonds being loosed by a goddess. Again, Abraham and the Narayana Purusha interrupted sacrifice from the Shatapatha Brahmana are much closer in the details here. Add to this the fact of numerous other details of Abraham's story closely matching Shatapatha Brahmana material, and it seems more likely that this was the direct source being used for the foundation of the story. Nonetheless, Vasistha and Vishvamitra are part of this story of Harishchandra, and we know from the Moses parallels that the biblical authors knew the Vasistha and Vishvamitra mythos generally. Thus, it seems possible the general themes pointed to could have been additional material used by the authors to shape the story of Abraham, particularly regarding Abraham's anxiety about having a son and the theme of son sacrifice that it leads to. The similarity with the Harishchandra story could be a secondary composite then in Abraham's story, a coincidence coming from a similar mythos, or even suggestive of a broader shared mythos involving this story type and its connected motifs within the broader Vedic corpus. As mentioned, multiple scholars have noted the similarity of the story of Harishchandra and Sunashepa to the Narayana Purusha interrupted sacrifice scene. Thus, they may come from a shared root, ultimately. Regardless, the existence of this story is one more piece of evidence showing how strong this theme of interrupted son sacrifice was within Vedic tradition specifically, and thus how likely it was that the majority of the pieces of Abraham's story came from Vedic tradition specifically, with the Brahmanas and the Mahabharata being the likely sources in particular. So these parallels to Abraham suggest that the fundamental source here is the Shatapatha Brahmana as a whole, rather than solely Purusha or Prajapati. Manu, who has the wife sacrifice god reverence test story, is technically a manifestation of Prajapati as the progenitor of mortals, sometimes in other texts called one of the Prajapatis. But he is still a distinct demigod with his own myths, and the wife sacrifice was not the same story as the interrupted sacrifice within the Brahmana. They were quite separate, and even far apart in the text. Thus, we must see the composer of Abraham's story as going through the text of this Brahmana and taking different scenes, different motifs, and simply combining them into his one sacrificer and progenitor figure, Abraham, combining the God reverence test with the interrupted human sacrifice to make the sacrifice of Isaac. Thus far, then, we see that Abraham is made out of scattered episodes from the Shatapatha Brahmana, and we can even see them in detail in how they came together. Progenitor who yearns to procreate for many years of austerity is tested to prove his God reverence specifically by sacrifice of a beloved family member, and complies almost without word and without hesitation. But the sacrifice is interrupted by a divine voice when the human victim is bound and ready, and an animal sacrifice is given instead. We can add to this a couple more things. Abraham's name means father of a multitude, while his original name, Abram, means something like exalted father, emphasizing his role of progenitor which dominates his story, while Prajapati is lord of generation, and indeed is treated as the progenitor father of all gods and beings. He is Prajananavant, the possessor of the procreative energy. He is the father deity per se, the archetypal father among the gods, as well as the progenitor deity per se. His power of procreation is what acts within all procreation in the cosmos. As god of procreation, he has power to grant fertility. This is fairly coincidental given the episode of Abraham with Abimelech. After Abimelech almost sleeps with Sarah, thinking she is unmarried, Abimelech's house is stricken by infertility. It is specifically Abraham who prays to God to bring a cure for the infertility of Abimelech's house, and Abraham's prayer succeeds. This would be in keeping with the power of Prajapati to grant fertility. This is also interesting since this very same motif, as we find in Abimelech's story, is famously also found in a story with Abraham and the Pharaoh. But in that case, it is a plague that afflicts the house of Pharaoh after he nearly sleeps with Abraham's wife, thinking she is unmarried. The same Abimelech motif also repeats again with Isaac. Not only is the binding of Isaac directly accounted for by the two sacrifice motifs of this Brahmana, along with Abraham's general role of father yearning to reproduce for many years and his connection to the power of fertility, but the birth myth of Ishmael, his other son, also finds its direct and uncanny parallel in this very Brahmana. So, taken as a whole, the connected set of parallels found in this one text becomes absolutely astounding. Ishmael has a simple birth and boyhood story, but it is unique and has a recognizable arc to it. Ishmael is born before Isaac, and at Isaac's weaning it is said that Ishmael mocks or sports with Isaac, and thus Sarah demands he be expelled. Ishmael and his mother Hagar are sent into the wilderness. Hagar and Ishmael run out of food and water, and so she places the young boy under a bush, lifts up her voice, and weeps. The text then says that God hears the boy's voice, presumably crying out in some way likewise, and sends the angel of the Lord to say that God will make Ishmael a great nation, and then to provide them with water from a well to sustain them. Genesis 21:18-21 reads, quote, "I will make a great nation of him." Then God opened her eyes, and she saw a well of water. She went and filled the skin with water and gave the boy a drink. God was with the boy, and he grew up. He lived in the wilderness and became an expert with the bow. He lived in the wilderness of Paran, and his mother got a wife for him from the land of Egypt. Unquote. But if one knows the Vedic mythology, this is almost blatantly the myth of the boy Rudra, called by his epithet Kumara or Mahadeva. He is born as the son of Prajapati. He specifically cries out, and his cry is that he has not been given any names. Names here explicitly means dominions, for among the names given are Bhava, meaning all existence, and Pashupati, lord of animals, as well as Sharva, the archer, and Mahadeva, the great god. Prajapati hears his cry and grants the crying boy these names, and in other versions of the myth within the Vedic corpus, these names specifically allow him to eat, a detail which matches the boy Ishmael starving and dehydrated and being given sustaining water by the angel at this very moment. But this is one detail which is oddly absent from the Shatapatha Brahmana version of the story. Nonetheless, this myth of Rudra is repeated in so many Vedic texts with so many variations. If someone was studying these texts, they likely would have known more than one variant of the story, among which are the versions where the dominion names allow him to eat. Rudra is known as three things that are extremely relevant to Ishmael. He is the one who cries at birth, and this is connected by folk etymology to his name even, so that it is said that the name Rudra means to cry. Rudra cries to the father god Prajapati, and he is given his dominions, which also allow him to eat. And this crying is connected to his name. Ishmael and his mother cry to God, and God hears, and this hearing is said to be the reason for Ishmael's name. So again, Ishmael is the crying child, expelled into the wilderness, and his name is now indirectly connected to this very act of crying, as the name comes from God hearing his cry. Rudra is the wild god. The wilds are his domain, and he acts wildly. As such, he is lord of animals and connected to their wild natures. Ishmael is sent into the wilderness and is said to be a, quote, wild ass or horse of a man, unquote, depending on how the Hebrew word is translated. So Ishmael is the wild one, like Rudra. Finally, Rudra is the archer. This is the meaning of his name, Sharva, and is his most well-known activity. Even in the Rig Veda, in his Rudra Agni form, he is sometimes shadily referred to just as the archer, Asta, as in hymn 1.71. Note that even in Canaanite mythology, the bow of the god El, who is the Rudra type, is known of and emphasized. So, like Rudra, Ishmael is the crying child, given dominions and sustenance in response to his cry, the wild one, and the archer. Being an expert archer is indeed almost the only thing we are told about Ishmael when he grows up. This is Rudra. Even the fact that Ishmael is sent away to another region and so is positioned as geographically an outsider plays into all of this, as Rudra is also sent to the wilds after his birth, and he is constantly positioned as the outsider to the other gods, to their society, out in the wilderness and on the fringes almost all the time. He is the god of the margin and not the central society. This is the passage telling of Rudra's birth and cry to Prajapati. From Shatapatha Brahmana 6.1.3.8 through 9, quote, "And these same creatures, as well as the Lord of beings, i.e. Prajapati, the year, laid seed into Ushas. There a boy, Kumara, was born in a year. He cried. Prajapati said to him, 'My boy, why criest thou, when thou art born out of labor and trouble?' He said, 'Nay, but I am not freed from, or guarded against, evil. I have no name given me. Give me a name.'" Unquote. See Stella Cromrish's The Presence of Shiva for a summary of the variants of this tale where the names given allow Rudra to eat and are explicitly dominions. Rudra is even the antagonist of Prajapati, directly shooting him in a central myth, whereas Ishmael gets banished for mocking, quote-unquote, Isaac, who, as we will see, is also Prajapati. Therefore, Ishmael and Isaac's conflict is perfectly placed for the suggested parallels. Oddly again, the very fact that Rudra is sent to the wilds after his birth is not exactly mentioned in this Shatapatha Brahmana version, as it is made much clearer in other versions, such as the one in Atharva Veda, Book 15, where the text repeatedly says, Rudra arose and went away to various regions, right after being born. Also of interest, while in the Shatapatha Brahmana version, Rudra is not overtly sent to the wilderness, beyond being made lord of animals. However, in the untranslated oral tradition of Scotland, Fionn MacCool, who is the Gaelic boy Rudra, or Mahadeva, is chased away to the wilderness upon his birth, and is taken there by a female nurse named Beaumall. Beaumall even procures for him a little home within a tree, and his life is threatened by a blacksmith while there. While in the Genesis story, Ishmael is placed under a bush, and his life is in peril from thirst. Eventually, Fionn grows enough to return and demand his dominion from Taig, who is the Prajapati, and he receives it. Thus, I find some of these details oddly absent in the Shatapatha Brahmana version, but nonetheless, they could only be coincidentally similar in Ishmael's story, or could be coming from one of the other variants of Rudra's story that had more of the similar details in it. Regardless, this story of Ishmael is essentially the same story as Rudra's, a very brief story but fitting perfectly the details we know of Rudra's birth and naming, and appearing in the Shatapatha Brahmana with the sacrifice and progenitor motifs we have already described. As Rudra is given 9 names, Ishmael is given 12 tribes, so that is another interesting point to consider. This parallel also explains the issue, which once again scholars have been unable to explain fully, of why Ishmael, who should be around 16 years old according to the other events leading up to this, is clearly being referred to as a small child in this story of his expulsion to the wilderness with his mother. The text of Genesis 21 says that Hagar carried Ishmael on her back, that she placed him under the bush as she couldn't watch him die, and that he apparently was more helpless and was going to succumb to thirst more quickly than his mother. None of this actually makes any sense if he is a 16-year-old, especially the carrying on the mother's back, but makes perfect sense when we see that the story has been adapted directly from the story of the newborn Rudra who cries to Prajapati. This story of the child Rudra was then fitted to the chronology of the story the Genesis authors were constructing. But the chronology they constructed made him have to be a teenager at this point. This clashes with the indispensable motifs of the Rudra story, where he had to be a child crying to God. Ishmael is referred to over and over again in the passage as a boy child or a lad, multiple times, this perfectly matching the Rudra story where he is called by the name Kumara, meaning simply boy child. Once again, the parallel in the Shatapatha Brahmana explains a mystery in the biblical text that scholars and commentators have scratched their heads over for a long time, while also revealing evidence of a compositional seam, a point where even source-critical scholars have noted there is evidence of compositional changes due to the contradictory descriptions. But what about Isaac's birth, and what about the mysterious 3 men who are identified as the Lord, or Yahweh, who visit Abraham and foretell Isaac's birth? What if even this story of the 3 men who have mystified interpreters for millennia had a model in this same source text, the Shatapatha Brahmana? Would this not tip the scale into certainty that this is the main textual tradition being drawn from for the majority of the story of Abraham? Before having Isaac, Abraham is visited by 3 men, who the text of Genesis 18 says are the Lord, as in God Yahweh. At the end of their visitation, they tell Abraham and Sarah they will have a child, and Sarah laughs. This is a bit reminiscent of the Vratya form of Rudra, who makes Prajapati find the gold in himself and engender it, thus giving birth to Mahadeva Rudra, as told in the Atharva Veda, Book 15, Hymn 1 version of Rudra's birth. That would imply the 3 men are a triple form of Rudra, like Rudra, Shiva, Agni, as we see with the Norse brothers Odin, Heinir, and Lothar. But this doesn't really line up. The Vratya of the Atharva Veda is never triple, and even Rudra in the whole Vedic corpus doesn't usually have this same outward triplicity we see with, for instance, Odin and his brothers, though the 9 names of Rudra, aforementioned, are directly said to give him a threefold nature in this Shatapatha Brahmana passage. This is actually true and worth contemplating. Also, Rudra is implicitly Rudra, Shiva, Agni, but this is not turned into an overt trio that appears at the same time. Thus, Rudra doesn't really appear as a group of 3 or overtly divided into 3 in other appearances. Also, the son born to Sarah after this episode with the 3 men is Isaac, not Ishmael, who would be the Rudra born after the Vratya Rudra tells Prajapati of the gold within him, And most of the Abraham material has been from the Shatapatha Brahmana, not necessarily from the other Vedas, where the Vratya story is found. There can be quibbles with this statement, but still, the emphasis has seemed to fall on the Shatapatha Brahmana for the closest parallels to Abraham. But what about this? One of the most prominent scenes of the whole Shatapatha Brahmana is the creation section of the 6th Kanda, when Purusha wants to reproduce and so forms the egg from the waters. This scene following the vital airs or breath of God creation myth section. The text says Purusha Prajapati then wants to reproduce himself. So what does he produce first? What does he make manifest to himself first? The Brahman, which is called the triple science, Trayi Vidya. The Brahman here is identified as triple, then, and Purusha Prajapati precisely uses this triple designated Brahman, which has manifested to him, to then engender the egg from the waters, which is to be the womb of his offspring, which he there and then places within the egg as embryo. The Brahman manifested to Purusha Prajapati and then used to produce the egg and embryo is explicitly triple, while the 3 men are somehow the singular Lord and also tell the couple they will have a child. The Brahman would directly parallel God, conceived as fully transcendent, yet here manifesting within a triple designation and giving the power to procreate. Abraham quickly brings the 3 men / the Lord first water and then food, including a huge amount of bread cakes made from around 36 pounds or 3 seahs of flour. Purusha, after manifesting the triple science Brahman, specifically creates the waters out of speech first, and then enters the waters with that triple science Brahman. He then produces the world egg at that moment with its shell of earth, and generates the earthly things on it. The 3 seahs of bread and the calf meat meal Abraham makes for the men, then, could be like the moment of this earthly egg creation. The enormous amount of flour used here has never been satisfactorily explained, and would make much more sense as a symbol of the world egg that is produced here in the Shatapatha Brahmana moment. While the flour used to make the bread is indicated as triple, being 3 seahs exactly, so is the earth that is created here given an explicitly triple division. This earth that the text then says the fire altar is constructed from. Quote, "This earth then was created as consisting of these same 9 creations. Hence they say threefold, 3 times 3 is Agni. For Agni is this earth, since thereof the whole Agni or fire altar is constructed." Unquote. See also from a different section of the Brahmana, quote, "Now as to this they say, thrice he should take with the formula in each case, for threefold is the sacrifice." Unquote. From Shatapatha Brahmana 1.3.2.18. The 3 men eat the meal, while at the equivalent moment when Purusha has first manifested the triple Veda Brahman, the text coincidentally says of it, quote, "For even before that person, i.e. Purusha, the Brahman was created. It was created as his mouth. Hence they say of him who has studied the Veda that he is like Agni, for it, the Brahman Veda, is Agni's mouth." Unquote. I.e., the triple science Brahman being a mouth specifically is emphasized, connecting it also with Agni, the sacrificial fire that consumes offerings. It is the mouth of the fire that consumes offerings, while the 3 men here consume the offered meal despite its massive quantity, like a great, huge sacrifice. This sacrificial meal then mirrors the preparation of the shell womb by Purusha and the mouth of Agni, aka triple Brahman, that is described alongside it. This suggests how the complicated formation of the earth as eggshell, which is then identified with the triple fire altar, could have been simplified in the biblical version into a massive amount of bread symbolizing that world egg that becomes sacrificial offering to the transcendent God, who is the mouth of the fire altar. But the match between the ends of each passage is what really brings the sequence into clarity. At the end of this Brahmana passage, the earth, which was the shell and womb into which the embryo was inserted, sings from joy. And so does the Agni who is on her back, presumably now the embryo Agni Prajapati, who the text suggests has been born as the child, because the earth has been spread open here. The female earth, who is functionally the womb, then, and the new child, Prajapati, sing to conclude the passage, while in her story, Sarah, who has been informed of her own impending pregnancy and child here, laughs spontaneously to conclude the passage. But this detail may be the clincher. When the womb earth and the child Agni Prajapati sing at the end of the passage, it says that is why they have the names Gayatri and Gayatra, meaning one who sings. When Sarah laughs at the end of the parallel passage, this also is directly the cause and explanation for Isaac's name, which is drawn from the laughter of his parents and means to laugh. One who sings versus to laugh, two variations on an idea of spontaneously vocalized joy at very similar moments after a conception has been formalized and completed. So the child gets a name from the same moment connected to singing or laughing in each, that is, from the surprised vocalization of joy emitted by the mother related to the conception and birth. This similar motif of the mother's vocalized joy leading to the name of the child concluding both passages, which each began with the triple designated absolute God, helping the Father to form his Son after also bringing forth waters, is too uncanny. These two clear motifs frame between them a more mystical and confusing process, specifically involving waters and earth, or a symbol of earth, with a triple division as well, being brought into contact with the triple absolute, who is like the mouth of the sacrificial fire. This process being like a symbolic sacrifice, which mystically brings about the new embryo within the earthen shell, or within Sarah's womb, which the massive quantity of flour has also stood symbolically for. Only 2 chapters after this section of the Shatapatha Brahmana, it tells the story of Prajapati and Ushas having their son Rudra, as aforesaid, who cries to them for dominions, the story of Ishmael. The Ishmael story also follows 3 chapters after the 3 men seen in Genesis. Nobody has ever been able to agree about how these 3 men could be the Lord, Yahweh himself, and why they are here in this triple form, which seems contradictory to usual theology. Numerous fairly desperate rationalizations have been tried, none of which make sense of the picture. And right there in the Brahmana passage, we have the Brahman itself, with a triple designation, ending with the child named for the vocalization of joy of his mother and himself. Thus, this Genesis scene looks like they tried to translate Brahman but triple into a more literal form, and for this reason depicted the Lord Yahweh paradoxically as 3 men, giving no further explanation. The strength of this parallel partially relies on the firm recognition that the rest of Abraham's story has been directly adapting this same text, the Shatapatha Brahmana, and thus the author had to know this particular passage thoroughly as well, being one of the most famous sections of the whole Brahmana, the creation of the world egg. It also relies on how thoroughly I have established the deep influence of Vedic texts on the other parts of the Bible. Once these things are seen, this more complex and mystical parallel becomes hard to escape as well. Additionally, Agni, the fire god who is sometimes identified with the Brahman itself, is sometimes called triple elsewhere in the Shatapatha Brahmana, and described in terms that might echo the 3 men eating the massive amount of offered food. If so, it could be that the three men seen combines some of the other sacrificial discussions of Agni with the triple science Brahman we have discussed, to paint a more sacrificial scene rather than a literal creation of the world egg, although both of these symbols seem to be overlaid in the Bible passage. Either way, this Agni material may be echoing in the background of the scene and should be considered as additional material the author would have likely read. I'll leave this question open. From Shatapatha Brahmana 1.3.3.14, 15, and 17 through 19, quote, "Lest that thunderbolt, the Vashat call, should strike me down and close me by those three Agnis, or Paridhis, and thus that thunderbolt, the Vashat call, will not strike me down." Unquote. And, quote, "They, the other three Agnis, then said, 'If you join us with the sacrifice in this wise, then let us also have a share in this sacrifice.'" Unquote. And, quote, "To the Lord of the earth, Svaha, to the Lord of the world, Svaha, to the Lord of beings, Svaha. These indeed are the three names of those Agnis, to wit, Lord of earth, Lord of the world, and Lord of beings." Unquote. And, quote, "The Palasa tree doubtless is the Brahman, and Agni also is the Brahman. For this reason, the Agnis should be of Palasa wood." Unquote. And from 1.4.2.15, quote, "Further, thou, O Agni, dost encompass the gods as the Feli the spokes, in the same way in which the Feli on all sides encompasses the spokes, so dost thou on all sides encompass the gods. This is what he thereby says." Unquote. And from 1.4.4.14 through 15, quote, "He sweeps thrice each time. Threefold is the sacrifice. He sweeps once with the text Vag S 2.7a. O Agni, food gainer, I cleanse thee, the food gainer, who art about to hasten to the food, whereby he says, I cleanse thee, who art going to convey the sacrifice to the gods, thee fit for the sacrifice. He then sweeps thrice over the fire silently, for just as after harnessing the animal, one urges it on, saying, Go on, pull, so does he thereby strike it with the lash, thinking, Go on and convey the sacrifice to the gods." Unquote. And from 1.5.1.11, quote, "Having named the ancestral, he says, like as Brahman, for Agni is the Brahman, the Veda or the sacerdotium, and therefore he says, like as Brahman, may he bring the gods hither. What deities he bids him bring hither, those he refers to in saying, may he bring them hither." Unquote. From 1.5.2.11, connecting the sacrificial fire symbolically to a womb, quote, "The Hotri, a priest, must utter nothing improper until the Vashat call. By the Vashat call he pours it, the sacrifice, into the fire, as seed into the womb. For the fire is indeed the womb of the sacrifice. From thence it is brought forth." Unquote. From 1.6.2.8, quote, "Agni, the fire, assuredly represents all the deities, since it is in the fire that they make offering to all the deities. To Agni alone, therefore, he should announce it, since he thereby has recourse to all the deities." Unquote. From 1.6.3.20 through 22, making Agni, Soma, and Indra instead a trinity symbolic of the totality of the gods, quote, "Agni then said, In me they shall sacrifice for all of you, and thus I give you a share in me. For this reason they sacrifice in Agni, the fire, to all the gods, and for this reason they say that Agni is all the deities." Soma then said, "Me they shall offer up to all of you, and thus I give you a share in me. For this reason they offer up Soma to all the gods, and hence they say that Soma is all the deities. And further, since all the gods were abiding in Indra, for that reason they say that Indra is all the deities, that the gods have Indra for their chief. Thus the gods came in a threefold way to consist of one deity, and he who knows this becomes individually the chief of his own people." Unquote. Not only does this story of Purusha and the triple science Brahman parallel the story of Isaac's conception, especially with the triple Godhead appearing at the beginning and being given water, and the audible mirth of the mother spontaneously emerging at the end, directly giving rise to the name of the child, But the story of Rudra's crying and naming occurs 2 chapters after this scene of the world egg formation, while Ishmael's crying and being promised a dominion happens 3 chapters after Isaac's conception. Thus, the episodes are very similarly positioned in order. Ishmael being Rudra, also identified with Agni, and conflicting with Isaac, who is the newborn Prajapati, yes, also identified with Agni, is the perfect dualism of these types, as mentioned. And making them brothers, while they are father and son in the Vedic version, makes them much more like the Avestan twin spirits Ahura Mazda and Ahriman. Ahura Mazda indeed mythically matching Prajapati, and Ahriman being a demonized Rudra type who thus parallels Ishmael. In the Zurvanite version of the story, Zurvan, god of time, is the father of these twins, Ahura Mazda and Ahriman, who are fighting even before birth, quite similar to Esau and Jacob, as Gary Greenberg has noted. This perspective then gives Abraham a faint echo of the Zurvan sort of role, if only by coincidence or secondary influence, since our source seems more clearly Vedic-like. However, Zurvan too performs a long sacrifice, specifically in order to have a son. This sacrifice being 1,000 years, the same length as Purusha Prajapati's sacrifice to drive off death, and the same length as his stated lifespan. As fb.com/Persian Mythology explains this image, number 1 shows the god Zurvan, or time. Worship of the unified god Zurvan became a heresy of Zoroastrianism, which regards Ahura Mazda and Ahriman as having existed in duality from the beginning of time. Number 2 symbolizes his sacrifice of 1,000 years. The god Zurvan, a unified, androgynous, undifferentiated god, longed for a son. He offered a sacrifice of 1,000 years to create one, but as the 1,000 years drew to an end, he began to doubt his power to produce a son. Number 3 shows Ahriman, the personification of Zurvan's doubt, spoiled the world by creating sin and evil. He defiled everything he touched, and rejoiced as he did so. "My victory is perfect," he crowed. "I have fouled the world with filth and darkness, and made it my stronghold. I have dried up the earth, so that the plants will die, and poisoned Gaiomart, so he will die." This can be compared to Abraham fathering Ishmael with his handmaid Hagar, because he doubted that he would conceive with his wife Sarah. But Ahriman is clearly much more demonized in this tradition, making Ishmael much closer to the hostile but ultimately beneficent Rudra of Vedic tradition. And number 4 shows Ahriman's good twin, Ahura Mazda. Ahura Mazda, also known as Ormazd, was the culmination of Zurvan's desire. He is an all-knowing creator whose plans for a perfect world are frustrated by Ahriman. Thus, just as Isaac is the culmination of Abraham's desire and prayer for a son as his true inheritor, so also Ahura Mazda plays this exact role for Zurvan. As I've shown, Isaac is the lower Prajapati, as the son created in the egg by the higher Purusha Prajapati. I have also consistently held that Ahura Mazda is the Prajapati-type god in his other myths, while Ahriman is the Rudra type also conflated with the Vishnu. This description of Ahura Mazda as the wished-for son of Zurvan fits perfectly with both the Purusha conception of the lower Prajapati and the Abraham fathering of Isaac stories then. Iranica Online notes that this story of Zurvan's 1,000-year sacrifice is preserved in Armenian and Syriac sources. Zurvanism being treated as a heresy within Zoroastrianism makes it even more unlikely that Abraham's story is directly Persian Zoroastrian, since the Zoroastrian version would have eliminated Abraham, demonized Ishmael fully, and would have made Isaac the sole good god remaining, since Isaac is the equivalent of Ahura Mazda here. The Abraham story preserves a more balanced picture that is still closest to the Brahmanas then, retaining Abraham and not demonizing Ishmael. Note also that it is specifically a sacrifice by which Zurvan conceives Ahura Mazda. and the Iranica Online entry on this topic concludes by describing the Yasna or Zoroastrian sacrifice ceremony as a cosmic ritual of creation and reintegration. This again fits perfectly with my argument about the three men passage from Genesis, where they are the triple Veda Brahman, the mouth of the sacrificial fire. Zurvan again is performing a sacrifice to have a son, but this Yasna sacrifice is a cosmic ritual of creation, because the Prajapati type god who gets conceived thereby is identifiable with the cosmos itself. This is why that lower Prajapati is the embryo of the world egg made by Purusha here. Thus, Abraham offering the massive amount of bread, symbolic of the matter for the world egg, to the three men who are symbolically the mouth of the sacrificial fire, the Veda Brahman, well parallels Zurvan performing a sacrificial ritual of cosmic creation in order to conceive his son Ahura Mazda, the Prajapati and Isaac type, just as these also parallel Purusha, performing a kind of rite by invoking the triple Veda Brahman and forming the world egg and the Prajapati embryo inside it. Cosmic creation as primordial sacrificial ritual in all three. Jan Gonda tries to make sense of the relation between the deity time, as Zurvan is, and Prajapati thus, quote, according to VS 19.53.10 and AVP 12.2.10, it is time, here also considered to be une réalité objective et substantielle, which is declared to have generated progeny, a perfectly understandable thought, and which in the beginning generated Prajapati. From this stanza, it may be concluded that the author went so far as to regard Prajapati as only the second ultimate cause of the universe. Time, however, as second to none. Just as in 19.54.1, in AVP, the next stanza, 12.2.11, which no doubt forms a part of the same hymn, he declares the primeval waters, Brahman, tapas, and the regions of the universe, symbolizing totality, to have come into existence from Kala, that is time. Stanza 8, speaking accordingly of time, the Lord of all, Sarvasyevara, as the father of Prajapati, does not contradict stanza 10. This reference to filial relationship implies that Prajapati is a sort of representative of the creative functions proper to Kala, time. One should not say that Prajapati is the deity Kala of the post-Vedic mythology. In the beginning, Kala generated out of himself Prajapati, and then through him progeny. The tentative and experimental character adopted by these pre-Upanishadic speculations, the Kala concept, is one of the single unifying principles from which the universe was supposed to have evolved. Unquote. And then from AVS 13.2.39 and CF AVP 18.24.7, quote, the ruddy one, Rohita, i.e. the sun, became time, Kala, the ruddy one in the beginning, Prajapati, and in stanza 40a, the ruddy one became the world, the Loka. These words are in stanza 41, followed by, he protects all that exists, sky, ocean, earth. The general sense seems to be that the sun first became time, then Prajapati as such fulfilled the two main functions of that deity, creation and preservation. The poet is not explicit with regard to the function of Kala in this process. However, this word seems to imply that Prajapati's activity presupposes the existence of time, that it is only conceivable as taking place in time, which is in turn regulated by the sun. Unquote. But remember that Rohita is also a Rudra name, and Sarvasyeshvara, referring to time, also almost sounds like a Rudra name, as Rudra is both Sharva and Ishvara. In general, the higher Rudra can be looked at like the luminous essence of the fire that is the Purusha or Prajapati, the foundation of his intellect. Since the Purusha is like a demiurge, this may be why Kronos is treated as the foundational principle of Nous, while Zeus is the outward acting face of the nous in Platonic tradition. These divinities only dividing from their unity on the lower level of manifestation where they become father and son. Regardless of all this, the conflict and dualism between Ishmael and Isaac is perfectly accurate to the Indo-European source when they are considered as Rudra and Prajapati, who are always found in opposition. Also, we may see a similar motif to Hagar's usage as the handmaid of the wife, who carries the chieftain's other child, in the handmaid of the wife of Dhritarashtra, who does similarly for King Dhritarashtra, the blind king paralleling Isaac from the previous video. We know the Genesis authors knew the story of Dhritarashtra, due to Isaac otherwise paralleling his blindness motif. So it's not impossible that the small element of the wife's handmaiden as mother of Abraham's other child could also have been taken from the same Dhritarashtra story and added in order to make Abraham's story flow as needed, especially since Abraham and Isaac already echo one another and overlap so much, both being Purusha and Prajapati in different ways, as we've seen. Between Dhritarashtra's actual wife Gandhari and the mother of her son's rival, Yudhishthira, there is even a similar anxious rivalry regarding the inheritance of her son. Gandhari takes too long to give birth to her son Duryodhana, even striking her own womb in anger. And so, like Sarah, the theme also echoing in Rebecca in some ways, Gandhari becomes anxious about her son's rival, who was born first, and now threatens her son's claim to the throne. We have seen the Duryodhana and Yudhishthira elements overlaid on Jacob previously, but this similarity to details of Sarah, who also has the childbearing handmaid, suggests that this particular part of the story of Dhritarashtra's wife and her handmaid may have found its way into Sarah's portion of the story instead, once again supporting an image of the author taking motifs from here and there and recombining them in different places, some of the Dhritarashtra-related material being attached to Jacob and Isaac, and other parts being added to Sarah and Hagar. I also wonder whether the fivefold nature of the Purusha Medha human sacrifice, or any other fivefold division in another sacrifice from the Brahmana, could parallel Abraham's covenant scene with God, since it also has the Brahmana sacrifice feeling to it. In Genesis chapter 15, God instructs Abraham to lay out 5 particular animals for this sacrifice. Meanwhile, the Purusha sacrifice preparation section 13.6.1.7 says, quote, "Now this Purusha Medha is a 5 days sacrificial performance. The sacrifice is fivefold, the victim is fivefold, and 5 seasons are a year. Whatsoever of 5 kinds there is, either concerning the deity or the self, all that he thereby obtains." Unquote. Then in the Genesis scene, God foretells to Abraham how his descendants will be enslaved for a period of time. Quote, "But I will punish the nation they serve as slaves, and afterward they will come out with great possessions." Unquote. Concluding with, quote, "The Lord made a covenant with Abram and said, 'To your descendants I give this land,'" unquote, etc. Meanwhile, the preparation for the Purusha Medha being the model of the interrupted sacrifice we've already seen, just after describing its fivefold nature, concludes in 13.6.1.9 and 11 with, quote, "Verily, whosoever knows this repels his hateful enemy. He alone exists, not his hateful enemy, thus they say of him," unquote, thus vanquishing his enemy with this sacrifice. And, quote, "Thus these worlds, as well as the year and the sacrificer's self, pass into the Purusha Medha for the obtainment and securing of everything," unquote, thus explaining how this fivefold sacrifice will both repel the enemy and secure, quote, "everything." Of course, other sacrifices in the Brahmana promise other boons, and many have numbered groups of animals as well, and any of these could have been adapted or combined with native Hebrew ideas of what the covenant should be to make Abraham's covenant. But the fire altar and the animal victims for it are also specifically fivefold in Shatapatha Brahmana 7.1.2.17 and 32. These 5 animal victims then being a good parallel for the 5 animal victims presented to God by Abraham. Quote, "Now it was those 5 bodily parts of his, Prajapati's, that became relaxed, hair, skin, flesh, bone, and marrow. They are these 5 layers of the fire altar. And when he builds up the 5 layers, thereby he builds him up by those bodily parts. And inasmuch as he builds up, therefore they are layers." Unquote. And, quote, "Here they say, how many animal victims are laid upon the fire altar? Let him say 5, for he does lay thereon those 5 victims." Unquote. That is from 6.1.2.32. Verse 32 of this section gives the sacrificer the promise of immortality for building and sacrificing with this bird-shaped 5-fold altar. Quote, "By assuming that form, the gods became immortal, and what thereby the vital heirs and Prajapati, and the gods became, that indeed he, the sacrificer, thereby becomes." Unquote. This certainly has echoes of the different promise that God gives Abraham for his 5-fold covenantal animal offering. Once again, we are breathing very similar air, despite obvious differences. The strangely tripled stories of the sister/wife deceptions of Abraham and Isaac with the Pharaoh and with Abimelech might even be explicable as allegories echoing the role of the sacrificer's wife and some of the specific ritual expiations found in the Shatapatha Brahmana. In Genesis chapter 2, for one instance, Abraham tells Sarah to say that she is his sister as they journey into a new land. The king Abimelech, thinking she is a single woman, takes her into his house. God tells him she is taken. Abimelech swears he hasn't touched her, and then God curses his house with infertility anyway. Sarah returns to Abraham, and the king gives Abraham gifts to compensate him. Abraham prays to God, and God cures Abimelech's household. This pattern is also found in an earlier chapter with Pharaoh instead of Abimelech, and then later with Isaac, his wife, and Abimelech yet again, like a trio of very similar repetitious stories. If Abraham and Isaac as his continuation and repetition is seen as the embodiment of the sacrificer, and thus his rather inexplicable actions as mystically allegorical of sacrificial practices rather than to be taken literally, then some fascinating possible parallels open up. There is a whole section of the Shatapatha Brahmana dedicated to the involvement of the sacrificer's wife in the sacrifice, even going into how she has questionable discourse with other deities and must be led home, or how she has questionable involvement with other lovers even, with prescribed expiations for her holding this intercourse or having these lovers that are then followed. Varuna in this section is in his common role of god of death, but also the king of the gods simultaneously, and is even responsible for disease in Shatapatha Brahmana and other texts, including specifically afflicting unborn children with death. Thus, both infertility and disease, the afflictions Abimelech and Pharaoh meet with after taking Abraham and Isaac's wives into their houses inappropriately, might connect to this role of Varuna. And from these afflictions, Prajapati and the sacrificer specifically are said to be the ones who gain the release of the afflicted beings from Varuna's grip, who do the expiations and have them succeed. Prajapati protects his creation or redresses evil also for the good of future generations of men. When he heals the living beings that had been seized by Varuna, he delivered also the unborn from that god's noose. See Shatapatha Brahmana 2.5.2.3, unquote. This is from Yangonda, Prajapati's Rise to Higher Rank, page 21. And, quote, "Now it was by means of the Vaisvadeva that Prajapati produced living beings. The beings produced by him ate Varuna's barley corn, for originally the barley belonged to Varuna, and from their eating Varuna's barley corn, the name Varuna Praghasa is derived, the name of the right. Varuna seized them, and on being seized by Varuna, They became rent all over, and they lay and sat them down, breathing in and breathing out. The outbreathing and inbreathing forsook them not, but all the other deities forsook them. And owing to these two, the creatures did not perish. Prajapati healed them by means of an oblation. Both the creatures that were born and those that were unborn he delivered from Varuna's noose, and his creatures were born without disease and blemish. Now when this sacrificer performs these offerings in the 4th month, after the Vaisvadeva, he does so either because thus Varuna does not seize his offspring, or because the gods performed the same offering, and both the children that have been born to him and those that are yet unborn he thereby delivers from Varuna's noose, and his children are born without disease and blemish. This is why he performs these offerings in the 4th month." Unquote. Note how frequently it is repeated that Varuna is forced to spare the unborn children who he otherwise would afflict and kill. This section then turns specifically to a discussion of the sacrificer's wife's involvement in Varuna's appeasements and to the grave question of with whom she has been holding intercourse, or even what lovers she has had. Quote, "Thereupon the Pratiprasthari returns to where the sacrificer's wife is seated. When he is about to lead the wife away, he asks her, 'With whom holdest thou intercourse?' Now, when a woman who belongs to one man carries on intercourse with another, she undoubtedly commits a sin against Varuna. He therefore thus asks her, lest she should sacrifice with a secret pang in her mind. For when confessed, the sin becomes less, since it becomes truth. This is why he thus asks her. And whatever connection she confesses not, that indeed will turn out injurious to her relatives." Unquote. See how her connection with others even injures those around her, if not admitted. Here, relatives. A footnote adds, quote, "According to Katya 5.5.7 through 9, she is either to give the total numbers or the names of her lovers, or to hold up as many stalks of grass. If she has none, she is to reply with no one else. He makes the wife speak or confess, thereby he renders her pure, and then he leads her to penance. Were she not to reveal the name of a paramour she has, she would harm a dear relative. Let her declare, 'So-and-so is my paramour.' By thus declaring anyone, she causes him to be seized by Varuna." See Taittiriya Brahmana 1.6.5.2, unquote. The text continues, quote, "Of these dishes there is one for each descendant. Here being one for each descendant, he thereby delivers from Varuna's noose one by one the children born to him. And there being an additional one, he thereby delivers from Varuna's noose those children of his that are as yet unborn. This is why there are the same number of dishes, exceeded by one. The wife offers together with her husband. Thus he delivers his offspring from Varuna's noose through conjugal union." Unquote. The text then moves to a description of the wife sending these other companions of hers home, and her being led back to her own proper seat as part of the sacrifice. Quote, "They are now together with her while she is led thither from another place. Hence she says, 'Ye companions, go home,' she says, because that wife, doubtless, is the hind part of the sacrifice, and he has just now made her take her seat to the east of the sacrifice. Home doubtless means the house, and the house is a resting place. Hence he thereby makes her rest in that resting place, the house. Having led her back to her seat, the Pratiprasthatri returns to his place by the side of the southern altar." Unquote. This concludes with a direct prayer to wipe out the sin that has been committed against the gods and mortals, and thus to preserve the speaker from injury. This seems dramatically quite similar to Abraham praying to God to cure the affliction of Abimelech's house after Abraham's wife is led home from being in that house, after her proximity to them has incurred the curse. Quote, with the text, Vag S. 3:48, "O laving bath, laving thou glidest along. With the help of the gods may I wipe out the sin committed against the gods, and with the help of mortals the sin committed against mortals. Preserve me, O God, from injury, from the fiercely howling demon." Unquote. Abraham, as mentioned, is fittingly the one who prays to cure the infertility of Abimelech's household. This is fitting, as this is the role of Prajapati, who not only releases the unborn from Varuna's noose, but also places semen and embryo into the womb, being master of the procreative power and of mantras that drive away death generally. Quote, in Rig Veda 10.184.1 and Shatapatha Brahmana 14.9.4.20 and in HG 1.25.1 is prescribed in the ritual performance of acts that will bring about a successful conception. Prajapati is requested to pour the semen in the womb, Pada C, and Dahatar, an aspect of Prajapati, to place the embryo, Pada D, unquote, from Gonda, page 28. Other offenses against the sacrifice with a similar structure are mentioned, which Prajapati specifically then expiates, again similar to the prayer of Abraham that cures the infertility. Quote, if the sun rises before a sacrificer's Agnihotra has been offered, his semen, though placed in the vulva, does not propagate offspring, unquote. But after the sacrificer has approached and propitiated Prajapati properly, quote, he, Prajapati, delivers him from the effect of that irregularity. The sacrificer does not fall into calamity. See Taittiriya Brahmana 2.1.9.2, unquote. From Yangonda, page 147. When after having created the gods and after them Mrityu, the evil or death, the gods asked him why he had created them, if it was his intention to create Mrityu also. He suggested to them a ritual means of getting rid of Mrityu, death. See Jaiminiya Brahmana 1.283, unquote, from Yangonda, page 7. And again, in further passages, Prajapati is specifically said to release his creatures from the grip of Varuna, though he himself was the one who caused them to be seized in the first place. This whole pattern is humorously similar to the Abraham and Isaac stories, since Abraham and Isaac are the ones whose fault it really is that Pharaoh and Abimelech don't realize their wife is married and thus incur the afflictions, which Abraham then expiates with prayer. In MS 1.10.10 and 150 and 20, quote, Prajapati had caused these creatures to be seized by Varuna. That the offering is dedicated to Ka, aka Prajapati, means that he releases them from Varuna for the sake of himself. But see also KS 36.5 and 72.16. He releases them through himself from Varuna, unquote. From Gonda, page 142. So Abraham and Isaac, who is his own echo, in some sense may be acting out an allegory of correct sacrificial practice and expiations, with the wife as symbol of the wife of the sacrificer, or feminine aspect of the sacrifice. The strangeness and triple repetition of these stories suggests an importance to them that hasn't been accounted for well enough by previous attempts at explanation. Even if they are reduced to 2 or 1 by source-critical analysis, as if they are just doublets from different authors in the text, this does not explain why the story was so important as to result in such repetitions. Again, the question raises its head, however. Why on earth would the biblical authors include an allegory of such foreign rites within their story, in a way that is now essentially incomprehensible without the original context? We should remember then that the intelligentsia of Alexandria did believe in magic, by and large. So did the biblical authors simply believe in the magical efficacy of the passages they adapted thus? Or did they think the allegory for how to treat a priestly sacrificer's wife still had some instructive value for the community, even in a stripped-down form? Or does a parallel like this only suggest a deeper root of natively inherited myth and ritual infusing itself into the Hebrew tradition from Indo-Europeans further back in time? And why does Abraham present Sarah as his sister in the first place and allow her to be separated from him in the way that we see? Some details of the Vedic rituals could again provide a key, for as a preliminary step in the framing rituals, the sacrificer's wife was made to go through a sort of initiation process, during which she was separated from her husband, specifically staying in a separate hut from her husband and entering the ritual grounds by a separate door. In this way, the husband and wife now operated in parallel rather than in conjunction, but only during this initiating period, after which they joined together once more. Operating in parallel, then, could be symbolically like Sarah calling herself a sister rather than a wife for a time, making herself directly open to the powers and deities of the sacrifice, while the return of the wife to acting in conjunction with the sacrifice would parallel Sarah's return to acting as Abraham's wife. The scholar Stephanie Jameson explains the process the wife goes through in parallel to her husband, the sacrificer. Quote, "The two undergo identical purificatory procedures, don similar garments, are vested with similar accoutrements, and endure the same privations with regard to food, speech, freedom of movement, and sleeping arrangements. In the consecratory procedures, each is tended by a different priest, the sacrificer by the advaryu, the wife by the prati-prash-tatar, a sort of assistant advaryu. They then stay in separate huts, the sala and the pantisala, respectively, and each has a separate cow assigned to him/her to provide them with its milk as their sole food, with the portion of each cooked in a different fire. See e.g. APSS 10.176.6 and KSS 7.4.24. This separate but equal treatment seems to underscore their relative independence. The wife does not just tag along with her husband, sharing his lot, but has her own dwelling, priest, and cow. Then the pair enter the main enclosure separately by different doors and take their usual places." Unquote. From Stephanie Jameson's fascinating book, Sacrificed Wife/Sacrificer's Wife, Women, Ritual, and Hospitality in Ancient India, from page 48 through 49. Jameson continues, quote, "The first action on the men's return to the western end of the ritual ground is thus to re-establish or reaffirm the ritual partnership between sacrificer and wife, and to do so by invoking, indeed creating, divine patterns for it. The wives of the gods, though nameless, provide our human wife with a superhuman model and assert her importance in the ritual schema. Though she has been neglected during the long period of activity at the Ahavaniya, she is now reincorporated into the ritual by this oblation to her divine counterparts, and further activities involving her participation now unfold with the added authority conferred by her connection with the divinities." Unquote. From Jameson, page 51. After this, a part of her role in the sacrifice is explained thus, emphasizing the use of her sexuality in paradoxical ways to enhance the energy of the ritual. Quote, "Her sexuality and fertility are being spread to the entire ritual by this theoretical contact. The power unleashed by the ritual, because of its contact with the divine, is spread back to her to increase her generative capacity. The wife's scope of actual activity must be restricted because she embodies danger and, quote-unquote, untruth. But she must also pervade the ritual in order for it to achieve the goals of its performance, fertility and increase," unquote. From Jameson, page 55. Now, in the conclusion of the episode with Sarah and Abimelech in Genesis 20:16, Abimelech gives silver and other gifts to Abraham as a sort of compensation, while saying that Abraham is to be like a covering of her eyes, Sarah's eyes. Actually, the translations and interpretations of this phrasing vary widely, and I'm unable to go into the details. Some translate it to say that the silver is to be a covering of the eyes of those around, as if to repair Sarah's honor in everyone's eyes. Other scholars suggest it could really point to a physical covering of Sarah's eyes, like a sort of veil. We again meet with a vague passage that even scholars struggle to make perfect sense of, and around which debate rages. It is once again very coincidental, then, to find the eyes, the gaze of the sacrificer's wife become a central issue in the Vedic sacrifice, specifically around the rituals we have just been looking at. Apparently, the gaze of the sacrificer's wife was considered to have a dangerous, sexuality-infusing power, and power of fertility that was paradoxically needed for the ritual, but had to be protected against simultaneously. Quote, "What the wife looks at becomes impure and ritually unfit. He puts it on the ahavantiya, one of the fires. Thus he purifies it. Thus he makes it pure and ritually fit. The very act that endows the butter with sexuality also pollutes it, and before it can be put to ritual use, it must receive treatment in the sacral realm, reheating on the offering fire and glances from priest and sacrificer, to partially reverse the potentially too virulent sexual strain injected by the wife's gaze." Unquote. From Jameson, page 57. To ritually guard against the dangerous potency of the wife's gaze, she specifically was made to wear a head covering, effectively a kind of veil, as she entered the ground of sacrifice. In alternate cases, the sacrificer covers her eyes, as would fit the concept of Abraham as sacrificer being the covering of Sarah's eyes. Let's read this whole passage as it's fascinating. Quote, "The position of the wife in the pravargya is more ambiguous. She is present on the ritual ground, indeed is girded and actively participating in the other parts of the Soma sacrifice that surround the pravargya. But for much of its performance, she is confined in her own hut, Pantisala, with the doors of the enclosure where the ritual activity is happening closed against her. See APSS 15.5.1. When they are about to proceed with the pravargya, they close the doors and enclose it from the wife. In the texts of the WYV, which do not specify her confinement, her head is covered by a garment when the crucial parts of the ceremony occur. See KSS 26.3.2 and Shatapatha Brahmana 14.1.3.16. The wife is not allowed even to watch the pot being made. The major effort seems to be to keep the wife from seeing the pot, and this is accomplished either by keeping her physically out of the enclosure and or by covering her eyes. But in some texts, this visual prohibition is dramatically reversed. When the kettle has been heated to glowing, her head is uncovered, if relevant, and she looks at the pot, with the verse KSS 26.4.12. The wife uncovers her head. He, the Advaryu, makes her recite, accompanied by Tvastar, while she looks at the Mahavira pot, saying, accompanied by Tvastar, the sacrificer, along with his wife, looks at the Mahavira pot. The reason for this dramatic reversal, the requirement for the wife abruptly to stare at an object which has heretofore been carefully screened from her gaze, is the familiar one, to effect a sexual pairing, as the Shatapatha Brahmana explains in 14.1.4.16, the pravargya is male, the wife female. A procreative sexual pairing is thus created. The sexual and procreative nature of the contact is also signaled by the mantra, accompanied by Tvastar, etc., which, as we will see, is used at a similarly sexually charged moment in the Soma sacrifice. But the BYV texts forbid even this contact. The wife recites the mantra while still confined away from the pot. APSS 15.8.17, the Pratiprashtatar has the wife in her enclosed area recite the rest of the Anuvaka. Accompanied by Tvastar, may I be of service to thee. Discussions of the pravargya in the secondary literature usually suggest that the wife is banned from contact with the rite because she might profane its mystical essence. But the texts suggest something different. The ritual is a dangerous one, particularly the great heat, both actual and mystic, of the glowing pot. It threatens physical harm to those in contact with it. According to the Shatapatha Brahmana, the wife covers her head lest she should go blind. Shatapatha Brahmana 14.1.3.16. While the pot is being heated, the wife covers her head, thinking, this heated pot is glowing. I cover my head, lest this heated and glowing one should steal my eye. Unquote, unquote. Jameson, page 57 through 58. And, Quote, some contact between the wife and the pot is desirable because such contact is procreative, but it is also risky to the embryos thus produced. On the other hand, no contact at all is simply sterile. The texts cited earlier, KSS, Shatapatha Brahmana, and MSS, are willing to take the risk. They grant the wife a single controlled glance at the end of the period of heating, but the BYV is more cautious and more ingenious. The wife avoids physical contact with the pot, and also the visual contact that is its equivalent. But by participating in the verbal portion of the ritual from a safe, screened distance, she gets access to the power of the ritual without the risks. I have discussed elsewhere the early Indic notion that the embryo in the womb is especially threatened by heat/fire, and the common visualization of this danger as a glowing pot, indeed often the Mahavira pot itself. In both cases of the wife's exclusion discussed, exclusion from the Mahapitra Yajna and from the Pravargya, the motive seems not to be to shield the ritual from a woman's profaning presence, as is sometimes suggested, but to protect her from the dangers posed by these particular rituals, the sinister forces of the world of the dead, or the too powerful energy of the glowing Mahavira pot. But in each case, there is some effort made, at least by some schools, to ensure her partial participation, or some substitute for it. Once again, the wife is vital to the success of the ritual, unquote. From Jameson, page 59. With this concept of the paradoxical redirected sexual energy of the sacrificer's wife, let's let Jameson guide us to a more detailed understanding of the Varuna Pragasa ritual, the aforesaid ritual where the wife has been fraternizing with others and is made to confess, under threat of Varuna's punishments of disease and death to the unborn. Jameson draws attention to how the redirected negative sexuality is also harnessed in this particular rite. Quote, Vedic ritual presents several examples of what, for want of a better term, I will call negative sexuality, situations in which what appears to be sexual misconduct or dysfunction is again used to channel sexual energy into the ritual, unquote, from Jameson, page 88. And specifically, she mentions how the wife has gone about among others and is made to confess regarding this. Quote, from MS 1.10.11 and 151.3, the ritual is truth and reality. Woman is untruth. Indeed, a wife who, though bought by her husband, then goes about with others, does untruth. Discharging her untruth, she approaches truth and reality. So when he makes her talk, confess, he thus makes her ritually fit, unquote. From Jameson, page 90 to 91. And this leads specifically to expiation. Quote, the confession does lead indirectly to a general expiation, unquote. Jameson, page 91. From this, as Jameson posits, quote, to serve ritual purposes, the wife needs to have a lover, or at least the fiction of one. It seems to me possible that eminently respectable, middle-aged Aryan ladies confessed, quote-unquote, to lovers they did not have, for the sake of ritual effectiveness. I think the confession may be a sham, a setup, with the named lover, quote-unquote, a non-speaking role parceled out to a bit player on the ritual scene. Why? Perhaps because illicit sex may bring a bigger jolt of sexual energy into the arena than proper marital sexual conduct, and the wife, as a locus of sexuality, was charged to provide this. A kind of animal passion outside of socially sanctioned norms is what is wanted, unquote. From Jameson, page 92. Quote, the actual confession occasions relatively little fanfare, and immediately after that, she puts a basket containing the meal dishes on her head and proceeds to the southern altar, where she, jointly with her husband, offers the meal dishes into the fire. At this point, the married couple pronounces a mantra that seems a displaced expiation for her supposed moral deviation. TS 1.8.3.1, etc. What wrong we have committed in the village or in the wild, in the assembly or in Indriyan, strength/war, to the Shudra or to the Aryan, what is against the customary law of anyone, of that you are the expiation. Hail! It is significant that both parties utter this mantra, though only one of them has supposedly transgressed, and that it is a mantra of the most general application. All errors and sins are covered. If one of the reasons for the wife's confession is to purify the entire ritual, then she is operating as a sort of ritual internal scapegoat. Just as she is the locus of active sexuality, she also serves as the symbol of impure behavior, and she then represents the transgressions of all the ritual participants, particularly her husband, when she quote-unquote confesses a misdeed supposedly committed by herself alone. Her confession allows her husband to expiate his own misdeeds without implicating himself. This expiation occurs simultaneously with the offering of the meal dishes that represent the sacrificer's family. The threat originally made to the wife at the interrogation, "If you speak falsely, someone very dear to you will die," is thus rendered harmless by a blanket, hence almost vacuous, repudiation of wrongdoing, unquote. From Jameson, page 93 to 94. And note how this is the sacrificer and his wife making the concluding prayer that entirely expiates the sin, just as Abraham himself makes the prayer that fully expiates the sin in the conclusion of the Abimelech episode. Quote, "Her confession both taps this sexual energy and dissipates its menace, and the energy can be immediately and safely transferred to the family through the subsequent offerings of the meal dishes, performed with domestic propriety by husband and wife together. As so often, the wife is the lightning rod for forces that the sacrificer cannot approach directly," unquote. From Jameson, page 95. Quote, "Examining the wife's confession in its ritual context demonstrates that it is not randomly placed, nor does it simply serve generalized purificatory ends, as others have argued. Instead, though it certainly has expiatory functions, it also almost slyly does something like the opposite, injecting a controlled version of uncontrolled sexuality into a ritual whose aim is fertility," unquote. From page 96. And we might compare this meal offering that concludes everything and centers the sexual energy and fertility energy into it. We might compare this with the recompense that Abimelech gives, which includes animals and silver. So by a sort of scapegoating magic, Sarah, just like the sacrificer's wife, has been a lightning rod of potent but dangerous sexual energy, stirring up and redirecting a power of fertility so that it can be harnessed and then infused into her and Abraham's own family. This story seems to be a symbolic allegory of the ritual establishment of Abraham's family and acts as a talisman to draw the power of fertility into that family as it is in the process of being set up in the Genesis narrative. First, the sexual powers are incited in company of the strangers. Then the wife returns and brings back this power into the circle of her own family. The expiatory prayer is made, and the impurities and potential divine punishments of Varuna are neutralized. Finally, Abraham, as the one designated to veil his wife's dangerous sexualizing gaze, is emphasized in the closing, as Abraham acquires additional symbolic wealth that may also tie to the meal offerings from the successful symbolic sacrifice, either comparable to the payment for the sacrificer or the sacrificial boons themselves as well. Next, we can look at the episode of Sodom and Gomorrah and Lot. Lot, whose name means veil, could speculatively stand for the veil of ignorance and darkness that has to be pierced by the wisdom brought by the intellect that is attendant on or within Purusha, the divine intellect of God, which is the higher Rudra himself inside Purusha. This Rudra is the essence of fire, and fire destroys Sodom and Gomorrah. This concept of the veil of ignorance would be paralleled by Aldwy of the Irish myth. On the other hand, Lot survives, while a pierced veil might be expected to be killed. Thus, the scene almost reminds me of the variation of the sacrifice, where Purusha himself is burnt in and as the fire sacrifice, the fire altar, even though he is the fire, and thus burns off all impurities and degradations that have accrued to him. He emerges not actually killed, but cleansed, rejuvenated, and renewed. If Lot were the alter ego of Abraham in some way, perhaps the side of him afflicted by the veil of ignorance, the side that accrues the impurities, then he could symbolically have the two cities of impurity burned down around him and yet emerge alive, somewhat like how Llasar, the Welsh Purusha, emerges from the fiery iron house still alive in the Welsh story that might parallel this. It is hard to pin down the exact symbolism here with Lot and the two cities, but given the context of Abraham as Purusha, it seems possible something like this is going on here. In Shatapatha Brahmana 10.1.3.1, one half of Prajapati himself is said to be mortal, the other half immortal. With his mortal part, he was afraid of death. The gods make Prajapati, who is identical with the great fireplace, by ritual means free from death, end quote. And in like manner does the sacrificer become free from death, unquote. That is in 10.1.3.6 and 8. In Shatapatha Brahmana 11.1.6.7 through 11, Prajapati, desiring offspring, makes the good gods, but then also the asuras, the demons. He smites them for being darkness to him, but the passage concludes by saying the distinction between them was illusion, thus directly tying the smiting of the evil ones with the concept of the veil of illusion. This, again, might connect to Lot's name. Quote, desirous of offspring, he went on singing praises and toiling. He laid the power of reproduction into his own self. By the breath of his mouth, he created the gods. And by the downward breathing, he created the asuras. They were created on entering this earth. Having created them, there was, as it were, darkness for him. He knew, verily, I have created evil for myself, since after creating, there has come to be, as it were, darkness for me. Even then he smote them with evil, and owing to this it was that they were overcome. Whence people say, not true is that regarding the fight between the gods and asuras, which is related partly in the tale and partly in the legend. For it was even then that Prajapati smote them with evil, and it was owing to this that they were overcome. Therefore it is with reference to this that the Rishi has said, not for a single day hast thou fought, nor hast thou any enemy, O Magavan. Illusion is what they say concerning thy battles. No foe hast thou fought, either today or aforetime. Unquote. In the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad 1.4.1, Purusha is said to be called Aham and to burn up all evils. Quote, and because he, before the whole group of aspirants, burnt all evils, therefore he is called Purusha. He who knows this verily burns up him who wishes to be Viraj in advance of him. Unquote. On the question of whether there was ever an earlier version of the story where Isaac was actually sacrificed, as some scholars have suggested, because of how many Shatapatha Brahmana elements we find in Abraham's story as a whole, the sacrifice scene more likely had the Shatapatha Brahmana motifs as its basis, which already included the sacrifice being interrupted. This needs to be remembered, and these then could have been merged with parts of an L-type story secondarily. Therefore, it appears unlikely that there was ever a simple transition from a story of Isaac being sacrificed by his father Abraham to him being then spared, but at best a secondary merger of the interrupted sacrifice connected to Abraham's son with the El and Yedud type story, which had the son being sacrificed. But El is not the model of Abraham. Thus, it seems unlikely there was ever a simple sacrifice version with Abraham and Isaac being changed to cancellation, but rather perhaps the other direction, some elements of the actually sacrificed son of El being merged into the cancelled sacrifice of Abraham's son, Isaac, which was more foundational to the Genesis story that was being created. This could even be intentionally polemic against the El story tradition. Keep in mind that the Moses golden calf story is an Indo-European version of a myth type that the Canaanites had a version of themselves, El's feast. But the Bible authors, the authors of Exodus, completely sidestepped the Canaanite version to use the Vedic story, the story of Daksha's sacrifice, instead. So this use of the Shatapatha Brahmana story, where the divine voice stops the sacrifice of the son, in contradiction to the El myth, where El does sacrifice his son, would be consistent with the way the Bible authors have been seen to directly replace the Canaanite myths, even in other books of the Bible, such as Exodus. The effect in this case being to criticize the human sacrifice of El by means of the interrupted sacrifice test of the Shatapatha Brahmana, a replacement by Vedic sources that also critiques the Canaanite myth type that it is replacing. After all of these parallels, some undeniably exact and some more loose, it is worthwhile to reflect on how Prajapati's other name is Brahma, while Purusha Prajapati's female counterpart is Vak, who is explicitly called Saraswati within the Shatapatha Brahmana in some places. Thus, we do have Brahma and Saraswati sounding eerily like Abraham and Sarah, though they here are usually called their other names such as Purusha and Prajapati and Vak, or Prajapati is shown as husband of Ushas, who parallels Hagar. If this naming was a cosmic coincidence, it would be a great one, but it could also be an intentional echo and a knowing wink being sent to us by the biblical authors through the centuries. Either way, what is most interesting is that we don't need this name similarity to see that Abraham is Purusha Prajapati / Brahma / Manu in the end, as the mythic correspondences pointing so strongly to the Shatapatha Brahmana are overwhelming enough to do away with the need for the mere confirmation of names. Names are often wishy-washy and unstable. Abraham is Purusha when he prays for a son for many years and finally conceives Isaac. He is Purusha Narayana when he has his human sacrifice interrupted by the divine voice. He is Manu, the archetype of mortal sacrificers, who is one of the Prajapatis, when he unflinchingly complies with the sacrifice of a beloved family member to prove his reverence for God. But then, surprisingly, he is Prajapati, who should otherwise be his own son, when he fathers Ishmael, who is Rudra. Thus, we can more or less see that the composers of the story didn't pay strict attention to coherence between the types, though they are very close. They were borrowing various pieces of story from the Brahmana and treating the text sort of like a buffet. They were mixing elements that otherwise didn't go together and might even contradict, such as this parentage issue, Abraham as Purusha in one myth and as Purusha's own son Prajapati in another. Yet at other times, of course, Purusha is called Prajapati himself. This marks another significant seam in the text, or a possible seam, which can be a clue to where compositional acts took place, such clues shifting the likelihood more toward an act of literary compositing rather than a purely inherited and seamless oral tradition. Likewise, Isaac, when born, is Prajapati, who also should be the father of Ishmael as mentioned, but when he is bound, he is a composite of motifs from the humans almost sacrificed by Narayana Purusha, and Manu's wife, who gets esoterically identified with a part of the sacrifice as well. The humans almost sacrificed by Purusha would also be symbolically the Purusha, as this is the Purusha sacrifice section, and Purusha just means man, symbolizing the cosmic man who is sacrificed. Microcosm equaling macrocosm, the sacrificer Purusha equaling the sacrificed Purusha. Thus, Isaac would embody Purusha once again in this aborted human sacrifice portion of his story. This would then make Abraham Purusha / Prajapati / Manu, and Isaac Prajapati / Purusha. It's no wonder Isaac's story motifs echo those of his father, and he is almost like a repetition of him. And I wonder if the authors were ever getting confused about which of them should have a given motif and how to fit the picture together with such overlap. Isaac then becomes based on Osiris and Thoth, composited with Dhritarashtra/Bhaga in the blessing scene in his old age, completing a very complex set of compositional seams, as we have seen in the previous video. Now, is Isaac also taking anything from the Vedic Soma, as Osiris is equivalent of Dionysus and thus of Soma, sacrificed god of sacred liquid? It's certainly possible, but a bit more vague and speculative. Prajapati, who is Isaac, is esoterically identified with Soma within the Shatapatha Brahmana, though esoteric identifications abound in the text. Even in the Rig Veda, Soma is one of only a couple gods called Prajapati as an epithet, with Savitar being the other prominent one. Furthermore, Soma is produced early on by Purusha in the Brahmana, and then elaborately sacrificed after being carted around as King Soma. See Kandas 3-5. Thus, as a production of Purusha, Soma is somewhat like a son to him, though not as marked. As said, he is sacrificed too, but the sacrifice is completed, not halted, and not in the God-fearing test format of Isaac and Manu's wife. Still, the fact that Abraham's sacrifice is his son rather than his wife or another victim could be linked to the role of the Soma sacrifice, if not to the Canaanite El and Yedud echo. Soma is identified as seed, as the seed of Purusha repeatedly, while Isaac is prophesied to call seed or descendants to Abraham. This again isn't quite the same. One detail that strikes me still is how Isaac meets his wife, in a sort of choosing test where he chooses the woman to marry who serves a drink of water most aptly. Mither, who is the Irish Soma, is involved in a wife-choosing test involving which maiden pours a drink a certain way, though it is Mither who is testing his rival in this case, and his rival the one who has to choose. His rival wants to take his wife, Aideen, so to do so, he has to identify her while she is magically disguised among other maidens. The rival picks one of the maidens because she seems to pour drink like the desired maiden. However, he chooses wrongly, and Mither takes home the desired woman as a result. This woman, Aideen, is a goddess of the sacred drink, heavily connected with it in her mythos. Then again, one of Prajapati's wives is Saraswati, goddess of waters, and thus Rebecca, wife of Isaac, giving water, may much more easily be explained from this angle. Or we might suggest that the woman who serves water the best, or the most aptly, could be connected to some role of the sacrificer's wife, as we've previously explored. Even so, Soma is Prajapati in the end, and Soma is Osiris, so we may entertain an echo here in whatever way we wish, or focus on the fact that Isaac is more clearly a Prajapati Purusha who becomes an Osiris Thoth Dhritarashtra. I always thought Osiris, despite paralleling Dionysus, had a stronger emphasis on the way in which he is a remanifestation of Purusha, for Purusha is the divided man, and Purusha is the sacrifice, as Osiris is, and as Isaac almost is, but is saved. These themes are also strongly present in Dionysus, who himself is identified with Protogonos, Prajapati, and so we do see a continuity of this overlap even in the Greek tradition. Based on the Shatapatha Brahmana delineation, I also have a hard time not seeing, quote, the Brahman, the triple science, Veda, unquote, as the parallel of the Logos or Word of God, as found in biblical and Greek traditions. Purusha makes manifest the Brahman, the triple science, which is identified with the Veda in 6.1.1 of the Shatapatha Brahmana. And then he makes the waters with Vak, and then he enters the waters with the Brahman, the triple science Veda, and creates the world egg there, which effectively gives birth to his son Prajapati, who we have paralleled with the birth of Isaac previously. We basically can prove at this point that the authors of Genesis had this book or the textual tradition it belonged to in one form or another, and knew this passage one way or another from all the parallels I've pointed to. The conceptual match is strong between the Brahman, the triple science Veda, with Logos. The Veda here is treated as this pre-existing but knowable structure identified with the Brahman, the Absolute itself. The Veda is knowledge organized in words. It is discoverable by enlightened rishis or seers, and it is the divine truth. Veda means knowledge and implies a knowable truth that is in all things but manifests in a symbolic text, the Vedas, via this act of knowing. Veda is this structured transcendental text of knowledge. Logos is the logical structure or discourse of the universe known only by the wise, but also identified with fire, similar to how the Veda Brahman and Agni are linked. The Veda is called the mouth of Agni. The Logos is used to mean the word in a transcendent sense. The word is with God as the Veda is with Purusha, the creator God, or as the Veda is identified with the transcendent Brahman as its knowable triple structure. The triple Veda Brahman is used in conjunction with voice in the Shatapatha Brahmana passage, most often linked to the biblical creation scene, where God creates by speaking, the scene which I've said also echoes into the conception of Isaac. But the voice is female and is the medium of the words. It isn't really the word itself. The Veda that is used in conjunction with the voice here, with Vak here, would be more like the words or word, pictured as a text that combines with voice to make the cosmos, thus a key agent in the creation. So is Veda not the word, the Logos? Interestingly, Purusha collaborates with this Brahman/Veda to make the world egg, or uses it as some sort of creation tool. And then the egg they make is also dubbed the Brahman, the triple science, as if it is the reborn Brahman Veda too. This is interesting because this passage apparently forms the model for Isaac's birth, as described. Isaac then becomes one of the main models, or types, of Jesus, prefiguring him. So Jesus repeats the story of Isaac, in which he is the reborn Trayi Vidya, the Brahman as triple Veda, the word or Logos, as I've suggested. It's like how people still say the Bible itself is the Word of God. Well, what is the equivalent of the Bible for Vedics? The Veda, obviously. So Veda is the word of Brahman, but also is the Brahman. And Veda is the discoverable truth of the universe, connected directly to fire, is similar conceptually to Logos, the discoverable logical structure of the universe, connected also to fire. It seems to work, but I'm open to counter-argument. This Brahman Veda is distilled into the single syllable Om, which symbolizes the Brahman after that, and can be even more directly called the great cosmic word of the Vedic tradition. The word that aids in creation, guides its own rebirth within the world, and is the absolute. Chandogya Upanishad reads, quote, Vishnu distilled the entire literature. From that distillation flowed out the triple Vedas. He distilled them again. From that distillation were extracted these three syllables, Bu, Bhuva, and Svar. He distilled these again. They being thus distilled came out Om. As a needle pierces all the leaves, thus by this syllable Om is pierced the entire speech. Om is verily this full, the perfect one. Om is verily this full, the perfect one. Unquote. Chandogya Upanishad. The commentary to this verse says, quote, Omkara is the name of Brahman, and the all-full and possessing perfect and excellent qualities. It is the essence, Atman, of all speech, because by explaining it, analyzing and expanding it, all words are evolved and explained. Thus it is the essence of all speech. Unquote. I must say at the end here that this strongly points to the three men of Genesis 18, not symbolizing the Trinity as it is later conceived in Christianity, as Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. If I am right, then, we have the original source for this three-men passage of Genesis, and it is based on the Veda concept, the absolute as seen by the mind as intelligible structure and divided symbolically into three. But the triple division in this original source, the Vidya, refers specifically to the three originally orthodox Vedas, the Rig Veda, Yajurveda, and Samaveda, later joined by the more sorcery-related Atharva Veda to make four. So this particular triplicity has no connection to Father, Son, and Holy Spirit per se in this passage. Its triplicity, as said, is also echoed in the triple Agni, the three sacrificial fires, but also in the trio of Agni, Soma, and Indra, who are said to contain all the gods, and in the 9 names of Rudra, who is said thus to be threefold. And Rudra is the luminous essence of Agni. Many other triplicities appear, but the Vidya specifically means the three Vedas, the cosmic knowledge divided into 3 categories of sacred knowledge: knowledge of rites and hymns and theology. Skanda Purana 3.2.33.28 through 32 also connects the 3 Vedas to the Trimurti gods Brahma, Vishnu, and Shiva, but this isn't really consistent across the tradition. In short, there is much more specific context informing the triple Veda conception here in the Shatapatha Brahmana itself, and it is not what would develop later within Christianity. The Holy Spirit, for example, is parallel to the prana, the divine breath, which precedes and forms Purusha in this very same passage, but has no clear connection to the triple Veda Brahman unless the prana is linked to the mouth of Purusha that is said to have existed before him somehow. Yet this may be less than exact. However, it also seems clear that the Brahma Veda does appear on at least 3 planes thus, as if remanifesting itself, and this could be worth looking at as well. Purusha, the cosmic man and father, progenitor, creator deity, makes the Brahman triple Veda manifest to himself for his use in creating the world egg. When he thereby creates the world egg with his own embryo in it, it is said that the embryo also is the Brahman triple Veda. Quote, "From it, the egg, the Brahman, was first created, the triple science," unquote. As Philo of Alexandria calls the Logos the, quote, "firstborn of God," unquote, in his Confusion of Tongues 62-63, saying of, quote, "that incorporeal being who in no respect differs from the divine image," unquote. The divine image for Philo being the Logos, that, quote, "the Father of the universe has caused him to spring up as the eldest son, whom in another passage he calls the firstborn, and he who is thus born, imitating the ways of the Father, has formed such and such species, looking to his archetypal patterns," unquote. Thus Philo calls this Logos the firstborn of God. Similarly, in the Brahmana passage, the text then specifically calls the embryo in the egg, which was just identified with the Brahman, the firstborn of the all. Quote, "Hence, they say, the Brahman is the firstborn of this all," unquote. This is from 6.1.1.10. Thus we have seemingly 2 levels of the Brahman triple Veda having manifested. The one used by Purusha to create the embryo, and then the embryo itself that is created, which is then also identified as Agni Prajapati, which names Purusha also had already been called himself. So he is also his father reborn. The embryo is his father Purusha reborn, in that sense. But then the text says something quite cryptic. Quote, "For even before that person, i.e. Purusha, the Brahman was created. It was created as his mouth," unquote. Somehow a Brahman was created before the Purusha as well, but was created as his mouth before his creation. This is almost impossible to understand, but it seems to suggest a 3rd level of the Brahman, if I'm reading it correctly. How was the mouth of Purusha created before Purusha, and in what way was it the Brahman? Is this the fully transcendent Brahman then, or is that even further beyond comprehension? Is the primordial gap of prana akasha that appears as the incomprehensible mouth and is connected to mouth imagery, and which kindled into Purusha, is that the mouth that's being referenced here? Such a mouth of prana would be close to the Holy Spirit, at least, since prana equals the Holy Spirit in some contexts. Or is it simply referring to the fact that the mouth of Agni is always Brahman already, and Purusha is the primordial Agni formation? Purusha is Agni, his mouth is the Brahman, necessarily. Is that the same thing as the prana mouth that forms him? Either way, this seemingly then forms approximately 3 levels of the Brahman in this one passage. So if Father, Son, and mouth of Agni before Purusha formation can be mapped to a trinity concept, feel free to try. But also be cautious, as it seems like the Brahman may be identified with more than 3 things in the Vedic corpus, and is at least symbolically identified with Agni generally as well. So the 2 or 3 levels here suggested may not have the same exact meaning one might be predisposed to look for from a Christian perspective. Please try to understand the Vedic conception on its own terms, as it seems to have more unexpected complexity than a simple, clear-cut trinity. This business with the 2 or 3 levels of the Brahman triple Veda within the Shatapatha Brahmana section seems actually to be what Helena Blavatsky was more or less getting at in certain parts of her theosophical readings of the Vedic tradition. Now, I can't comment on how close she was to being accurate, as I'm not well acquainted with her work, but some similar conclusions pop up when I search the web on the concept of 3 logoi. Keep in mind that 3 logoi isn't really what Trinitarians are arguing either. They usually say only one of the Trinity is Logos, the Son. And the Brahmana passage more so treats this Brahman as always one and the same with a triple division, but manifesting at different moments as a power or intelligible structure made and used by the Creator deity and paradoxically reborn as him too. Reducing this rather lush complexity to Christian Trinitarianism would, I think, lose a lot of the sophisticated, visionary intent and original meaning of these theological concepts, which came embedded in a complex, larger theological structure, which can be called the Veda itself. Perhaps only the mystics really know it and how it works. Thus, the majority of the mysticism of Yahweh, then, goes back to pre-existing sources. There can be no question that although the panentheistic Brahman mysticism of the Vedic religion is not quite the same as Yahweh monotheism to say the least, that the former informed and directly influenced the latter, since we can see the Yahweh mysticism being shaped by these Brahmana stories as they are being adapted and used directly as stories of Yahweh within the most important canonical stories of Yahweh in the Old Testament. So I ask, did the biblical authors simply believe in magic, as we might expect from ancient people? And why not? Didn't the magic work in some sense? Were they practically perennialists or syncretists, but steering toward a mystical monotheism centered around their nation? What explains this picture best, and why has the text been written with so much seemingly foreign mysticism preserved and only partially transformed? The fact that the triplicity of the 3 men of Genesis 18 appears to be based directly on the triple Veda Brahman concept in itself implies this is probably derived from Vedic culture and not an Indo-Aryan group like the Mitanni. The 3 Vedas are clearly a Vedic concept, the 3 primary holy books that define the Vedics as Vedic. These 3 holy books developed in this triple grouping in specific circumstances, and though we can't say for sure, let me emphasize that, we have no reason to think such a grouping existed prior to the Vedas themselves or in different branches. Again, it is always possible there could have been a triple division in a similar concept, but this one is tied to the 3 Vedas specifically. So far, I've presented the case as if the Vedic material was borrowed late from a written Vedic text or texts. This has been for the sake of clarity, for the sake of argument, so that the points of contradiction or evidence of possible composition, the seams, will not be missed. These are some of the most important details for me to get across. However, the case is not settled, and I very much see it as rich ground for debate. What really and exactly happened here? Do the unexplained oddities I've listed add up to enough to suggest a deeper root connecting farther back to the Indo-European tradition by way of a lived inheritance instead? Or is late literary borrowing, composition at Alexandria, the most likely explanation? The fact that the story structure and central motifs are predominantly Vedic would suggest either a near-complete domination of Indo-European religion and story within the inherited tradition the Bible authors were working from, or simply the direct borrowing at a late time to make these stories as literary composites. Note the Amorite origin hypothesis as one possibility, which suggests others in a similar vein. From Wikipedia, quote, "According to Nissim Amzalag, the Book of Genesis portrays Abraham as having an Amorite origin, arguing that the patriarch's provenance from the region of Haran, as described in Genesis 11:31, associates him with the territory of the Amorite homeland. He also notes parallels between the biblical narrative and the Amorite migration into the southern Levant in the 2nd millennium BCE. Likewise, some scholars like Daniel E. Fleming and Alice Mandel have argued that the biblical portrayal of the patriarch's lifestyle appears to reflect the Amorite culture of the 2nd millennium BCE, as attested in texts from the ancient city-state of Mari, suggesting that the Genesis stories retain, quote, historical memories of the ancient origins of some of the Israelites. Alan Millard argues that the name Abram is of Amorite origin, and that it is attested in Mari as Abiram. He also suggests that the patriarch's name corresponds to a form typical of the Middle Bronze Age and not of later periods." Unquote. Please check out my Patreon if you would like to support the channel and see all of the important topics I have in mind get made into videos, as well as supporting the completion of my second book, Briochan's Tower, in which many mysteries will be solved. My book, Taliesin's Map, is available from Amazon, link in the description. Make sure to like and subscribe for more, as we map the myths.